When this news made the headlines throughout Singapore, nobody believed it. Singapore is one of the safest countries in the world. It only had one serial killer, ever. But the murder of Ayakannu Marithamuthu was no joke. In 1984, the 34-year-old caretaker was killed, dismembered by a butcher, then cooked into curry. Except it was far from tasty. Several people complained about the bad curry. And when the police finally took on the case, they unraveled a very complicated story. Let's explore who murdered Ayakannu, why they did it, and how they got away with it. Welcome to Crime City. On January 9th, 1987, the police department in Changi, Singapore was having a slow day as usual. Not a lot of tough crimes happen in Singapore, which is what made the following event extra strange for the police officers. Detective G. Alagamalai's pager buzzed. It was his trusted informant. He told Detective G he'd been wanting to talk about this for 2 years. Now, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The informant said that 2 years before, he had some very strange curry at the Orchard Road Presbyterian Church. There was something off about the meat. He was convinced he'd eaten Ayakannu Marithamuthu, the 34-year-old caretaker. Imagine hearing this as a detective in the 6th safest country in the world, a place where the murder rate is 0.17 per year. Detective G didn't believe his informant at all. He thought he was drunk or in the mood for bad jokes. But when he told his informant to knock it off, he only became more serious. He said he knew all about Ayakannu. He was an Indian-born immigrant, born in 1950. He'd come to Singapore with his wife, Ramia, and their 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter, around 1980, and they all lived in a small house behind the Presbyterian Church. Ayakannu was a caretaker at the Public Utilities Board-run holiday chalets situated alongside Biggin Hill Road, while some of his family worked at the church. But Ayakannu vanished at the end of 1984, and the informant was sure he'd eaten him in a curry in January 1985. He just had a really off feeling about that curry. Detective G didn't know what to feel. The story was as disgusting as it was outrageous, and simply hard to believe. But when he got back to the station, he thought he'd share it with his superiors. And since there wasn't much to do those days at the station, they told the detective to take the case if you so wished. Detective G would uncover one of the most haunting and bizarre cases in Singapore's history. Detective G wasn't going to waste any time. He was deeply intrigued by this crazy story, and as soon as he looked into the name Ayakannu Marithamuthu, he discovered a missing person file. Back in December 1984, his own wife, Nagaratha Vali Ramia, had reported him missing. She had told the police that Ayakannu was going to borrow some money from his employer and go on vacation in Genting Highlands, Malaysia, a location famous for its casinos. At the time, the police quickly dismissed the case as a man running away from his family. Then it was forgotten, and the family never contacted the police again. But there were several strange things about this missing person file. On the one hand, Detective G thought it was highly unlikely that Ayakannu would go gambling or borrow money from his employer. He had just borrowed $600 to pay for his children's school books. This meant that he still owed money to his employer and that he had no money left to gamble. On the other hand, it didn't look like Ayakannu was planning on abandoning his family. First, he disappeared before his planned vacation, and second, he had taken days off of work just prior to Christmas Day. This meant that he was planning on staying home for the holidays. Why would he disappear just 2 days before going on holiday? And there was something else, perhaps the biggest clue of all. Ramia had reported him missing, then stopped all contact with police. In Ayakannu's case, nobody seemed to care. His wife and children even left home months after his disappearance. Ramia took a caretaker job at the Fuchao Methodist Church and took her family with her, as if she knew Ayakannu was never coming home again. So throughout early 1987, Detective G spoke to everyone who knew Ayakannu, not just his family, neighbors, churchgoers, church staff, and anyone who'd heard something. That's when a clearer picture started forming in the detective's mind. You see, no one seemed to say, "Poor Ayakannu, he was a good man. I wonder what happened to him." Most people were like, "Good riddance." Ayakannu was a notorious, raging alcoholic who beat his wife viciously every single day. He would beat and kick Ramia in front of their children and in front of Ramia's brothers, who also lived in Changi. The neighbors would hear their fights and would see Ramia bruised every day. And there's another side to the story here. In tradition Asian culture, divorce is rarely an option. People who choose to get a divorce often suffer a great deal of shaming and can even lose their family's support because of this. Knowing this, Detective G started getting the gist of what had actually happened. One of the first suspects Detective G found was one of Ramia's brothers, who was a butcher and mutton seller. In the words of Detective G, a mutton seller would have heavy choppers that tied in quite nicely with the case. Indeed, if the informant's story was true and Ayakannu had been turned into curry, a butcher would have known how to dismember his body. But Detective G had a feeling there were more people involved, and he wanted to lay low until he had all the names. That way, he could make sure that no one would skip town before their arrest. By March 23rd of that year, Detective G had 3 more suspects, 2 men and a woman, working at 2 churches in the finance ministry holiday bungalows in Changi. That night, officers from the Special Investigations Section conducted a huge raid. Several locations were raided simultaneously at 2 a.m., and 8 suspects were arrested. They were all Ayakannu's relatives: his wife, her 3 brothers, their wives, and Ramia's mother. Ramia's brother, Balakrishna, worked as a butcher and mutton seller. Her other 2 brothers, Radhakrishnana and Chamugam Chandra, worked as caretakers at the Finance Ministry Holiday Bungalows and the Orchard Road Presbyterian Church. Out of the 8 suspects, some denied their involvement loud and clear, while others stood in silence, wearing a perfect poker face and waiting for the police to arrest them. But one of them cracked under pressure from the officers. They said that the murder took place inside the Presbyterian Church's caretaker quarters. On December 12, 1984, Ramia's 3 brothers took Ayakannu by surprise and dragged him into the church. This was going to be an intervention.
Keep your hands off our sister or we'll beat you up.
But Ayakannu didn't take this well. He wanted to fight the brothers, so the brothers decided to end his life. They pinned him down to the ground and bludgeoned him to death with an iron rod. But here's where the story gets really gruesome. The family realized they couldn't just bury Ayakannu's body in a wooded area. They would surely get caught. And since Balakrishna was a butcher, he knew his way around a carcass. So he took his best meat cleavers and deboned Ayakannu's body just like he would a mutton's. Then, the family proceeded to cook batches and batches of curry and biryani with Ayakannu's meat. Not only were these traditional Indian dishes, but they contained a lot of hot spices and chili powder, something to mask the awful taste, they thought. The big bones and skull were crushed and put in black plastic bags and thrown in several rubbish bins all across the neighborhood. What about the curry, you ask? Well, there was a lot of it, so Ayakannu's family put it into big bags. Some were simply disposed of, just like restaurant food that's gone off. Others, well, they were brought to various local churches in Changi, Singapore. Several people had human curry without knowing it. One of the people the police interviewed was a sanitation worker. He was once cleaning a large dumpster when he noticed a perfectly sealed bag filled with curry. It smelled nice. It seemed fresh, too. What a waste, he thought, and he proceeded to have a taste of the curry. But it was so bad he had to spit it out. And as the police spoke to the many churchgoers in the area, they uncovered a gruesome reality. Many of them had had very bad curry in December 1984 and January 1985. On March 27, 1987, the 3 brothers and Ramia were charged with murder. Ramia's sister-in-law, Mary Manui, and mother, Kamachi, were charged with abetting the crime. The case made headlines all over the country. Central Investigations Department Director Jagajit Singh said,
"Unusual because the remains of the body have never been found and the deceased had not even been reported to have been murdered. Bizarre because of the manner in which the body was disposed of."
Here's a weird final twist. 3 months later, all 6 suspects were brought to court. Detective G and his team of dedicated officers were convinced the family was going to be put behind bars. They had a suspect's partial confession, accounts from various people who knew Ayakannu, and a pretty clear theory to present to the judge. 200 people attended the trial. It was a huge event for Singapore at the time. All 6 suspects were facing the death penalty. Journalists from all over the country were eager to hear the verdict, but the prosecution said there was no way to proceed with the case. First of all, Ayakannu's body was disposed of to perfection. No one bit of him was ever found, to this day. The murder weapon wasn't found either, nor did Balakrishna's meat cleavers hint at anything. Perhaps the police didn't analyze them closely enough, or perhaps DNA traces were impossible to get with 1987 technology. Ayakannu's killers might never be fully brought to justice. All the police have is an outrageous confession and several reports of bad curry. All 6 suspects were discharged and released, and the case was dismissed. This doesn't mean they're acquitted, though. They can still be charged with the same offense if enough evidence is presented. The police promised they would be conducting further investigations, hoping for more evidence against the family. And on the day of their release, the 3 brothers were arrested again under the Criminal Law Act. They were held in Changi prison for 4 years. But today, Ayakannu's killers roam free. They might even have aliases, forever protected by police scrutiny. However, Ayakannu's death is a complicated story. Should Ramia even face the death penalty? Does her husband's constant abuse warrant her brother's decision? And just how responsible was Ramia if the murder wasn't planned? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. See you next time.